How quickly can a moment of arrogance turn into regret? Officer Brad Whitman never imagined that today would be the day his world flipped upside down. It started like any other afternoon. The streets buzzed with the usual city life, the warm sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Officer Whitman sat in his patrol car, sipping a coffee that had long gone cold. He prided himself on keeping the neighborhood in order, which in his mind often meant keeping an extra eye on certain individuals. Then he saw him, a tall, well-built black man in a sharp navy blue suit, stepping out of a sleek black SUV in front of a quiet cafe. Whitman narrowed his eyes. Something about the man rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the confident way he walked, or how he glanced around with an air of authority. Whitman had seen plenty of men like him before, men who thought they were above the rules. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and pulled up next to the SUV. The man barely had time to shut his door before Whitman called out, "Hey, hands where I can see them!" The man raised an eyebrow, his face unreadable. "Excuse me?" Whitman stepped out of his vehicle, resting a hand on his holster. "Step away from the car," he ordered. "I need to see some identification." The man sighed but complied. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had nothing to prove. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a leather wallet, and handed over a card. Whitman barely glanced at it before scoffing. "What are you doing in this area?" he asked, ignoring the credentials completely. The man remained calm. "Having coffee? Is that a crime?" Whitman smirked. "That depends. This your vehicle?" "Yes." "Mind if I take a look inside?" The man's expression hardened. "Actually, I do mind. And unless you have probable cause, I believe I have the right to refuse." Whitman's jaw clenched. He hated when people talked back, especially with that smug tone. "Well, I don't like your attitude. Turn around. Hands on the vehicle." For a moment, the man didn't move. He studied Whitman with piercing eyes, as if debating whether to comply or call his bluff. Finally, with a controlled breath, he turned, placing his palms against the SUV. Whitman grabbed his radio. "Need a unit over on 5th and Lexington? Possible stolen vehicle?" The man let out a quiet chuckle. "Stolen vehicle? That's a bold assumption." Whitman ignored him. He reached for his cuffs. "You're being detained for suspicious behavior." As he snapped one cuff onto the man's wrist, the world shifted in an instant. A sleek black sedan pulled up, followed by another. Doors flew open, and men in dark suits stepped out with a sense of urgency. Whitman barely had time to process before one of them barked, "Officer, release him, now." Whitman hesitated. "Excuse me, who the hell are you?" One of the men flashed a badge. "United States Secret Service. The man you just handcuffed is Agent James Carter in active duty." Whitman's stomach dropped. He turned to face the man he had just restrained, his breath catching. Carter now wore a different expression of controlled amusement and undeniable power. "I tried to tell you," Carter said calmly, "but you were more interested in proving a point." Silence hung in the air. Whitman felt the sweat bead on his forehead as reality sank in. He had just arrested a federal agent. Not just any agent of the elite, tasked with protecting the most powerful figures in the country. And now, the situation was completely out of his control. The senior Secret Service agent stepped closer. "Remove the cuffs," he ordered. His voice was calm but firm, leaving no room for debate. With shaking hands, Whitman fumbled with the key and unlocked the cuff. Carter rolled his wrist, his eyes still locked onto the officer. "You know," Carter said, adjusting his suit, "I deal with threats to national security every day, but somehow it's always people like you who think they have the most power." Whitman opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His face burned with humiliation as the realization set in his arrogance had led him straight into a trap of his own making. And there was no undoing what had just happened. Sergeant Blake paced back and forth outside the precinct, his nerves still on edge after what had happened with James Carter. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some were amused, others were concerned. The weight of the situation was starting to sink in. He had just arrested a man who turned out to be a Secret Service agent. His hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, the ember glowing in the dim evening light. Inside the precinct, Carter sat in an interrogation room, his hands resting calmly on the table. His expression was unreadable. The badge he had revealed during his arrest now sat in the middle of the table, a stark reminder of Blake's grave mistake. Chief Daniels had already spoken with Carter briefly and was now giving Blake the opportunity to explain himself. The chief entered the room, his eyes heavy with disappointment. "Blake, sit down." Blake hesitated before pulling out a chair and sitting across from Carter. His pride had taken a hit, but his arrogance still lingered. "Sir, I—" Chief Daniels raised a hand, cutting him off. I don't want to hear excuses. I want to know exactly what went through your head when you decided to arrest a man for no reason. Blake glanced at Carter, who remained silent, studying him with an unsettling calmness. I thought he was acting suspiciously. He was standing near a high-end store, looking around as if he was waiting for something. When I approached, he gave me attitude. Carter finally spoke, his voice measured. Attitude? He let out a small, humorless chuckle. I showed you my ID, Sergeant. I identified myself. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? Blake clenched his jaw, unable to respond. Chief Daniels leaned forward, his voice low and firm. Blake, do you understand the gravity of what you've done? You racially profiled a man who is not only innocent, but someone who protects this country at the highest level. If he hadn't been who he is, this could have ended very differently, and you know it. Blake swallowed hard. His entire career flashed before his eyes. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, but now he wasn't so sure. Carter exhaled, shaking his head. Sergeant, let me ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated for simply existing? Blake blinked, caught off guard by the question. Carter leaned in slightly. Have you ever been treated as a threat just because of the way you look? Because let me tell you, this isn't the first time something like this has happened to me. But this is the first time it's happened when I'm wearing a badge that should have protected me. The room fell silent. Blake didn't have an answer. He had spent years believing that his instincts were always right, that he was protecting the city. But now, he wasn't so sure. Chief Daniels finally spoke. Blake, you have two options. You can continue down the path you're on, pretending this was just an honest mistake, or you can take this as a moment to reflect and change. But I'll tell you one thing, you're on thin ice. Carter stood up, picking up his badge from the table. He looked at Blake one last time before heading for the door. You got lucky tonight, Sergeant, but next time, someone might not be so forgiving. Blake remained seated, staring at the table, his mind racing. The arrogance he had carried for so long was cracking, revealing something deeper doubt, and maybe even shame. As Carter walked out of the precinct, the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air. This was more than just a mistake. It was a wake-up call. Blake sat in his patrol car long after his shift had ended, staring blankly at the rain-speckled windshield. The events of the night replayed in his mind on an endless loop, the dismissal in Carter's eyes, the weight of the chief's words, the raw humiliation he had never experienced before. He had spent years believing in his instincts, believing that he was on the right side of justice. But now he wasn't so sure. At home, his wife Lisa could sense something was wrong the moment he walked in. Blake, what happened? She asked, concern etching lines across her face. He hesitated before speaking. I messed up, Lisa. She guided him to the couch, waiting patiently for him to continue. Slowly, he recounted the events of the night the arrest, the confrontation, the gut-wrenching realization that he had been wrong. He was a Secret Service agent, Lisa, and I treated him like a criminal just because... Blake stopped himself, his throat tightening. Because he's black, Lisa finished for him, her voice heavy with understanding. Blake didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said it all. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You have a choice now. You can either stay the same or you can do better. The words lingered with him as he lay in bed that night, sleep evading him. The next morning, he knew what he had to do. Blake showed up at the Secret Service office in downtown D.C., feeling out of place in his civilian clothes. The receptionist eyed him warily. Can I help you? I need to speak with James Carter, he said, his voice firm but uncertain. It's important. Minutes felt like hours until Carter finally appeared, his expression unreadable. Sergeant Blake, he said, crossing his arms, didn't expect to see you here. Blake swallowed his pride and met Carter's gaze. I came to apologize. Carter studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. Let's take a walk. The two men stepped outside, the city bustling around them. Blake took a deep breath. I was wrong. I let my biases control my actions, and I humiliated you for no reason. There's no excuse for that. Carter remained silent, letting him speak. Blake continued, I need to be better, and I don't know where to start. Carter exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You start by listening, by unlearning, by putting in the work. Blake nodded. Then teach me. Carter considered him for a long moment before finally saying, Meet me here tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. A small, genuine smile crossed Blake's face for the first time in days. I'll be here. As he walked away, he felt something he hadn't in a long time hope. The next morning, Blake arrived at the Secret Service office at exactly 6 a.m. The city was just waking up, the streets still damp from the night's rain. He found Carter already waiting outside, leaning against a lamppost with a cup of coffee in hand. "You're on time," Carter noted, handing Blake a second cup. "That's a start." Blake took it, nodding in appreciation. "So, what's first?" Carter led him to a community center a few blocks away, where a group of young men and women, most of them Black and Latin hour, gathered in a circle, listening to a woman speak. "This is where you start," Carter said. Blake hesitated. "What is this?" "A mentorship program for at-risk youth. These kids get profiled, just like I did. They don't need another cop treating them like criminals. They need someone to see them for who they are." Blake felt a weight settle in his chest. He wasn't sure he was the right person for this, but he also knew he couldn't turn away. Over the next few weeks, he kept showing up. Listening. Learning. He sat with young men who had been harassed for no reason, heard the anger and fear in their voices. And slowly, he started to understand. Change didn't come all at once, but brick by brick, he was rebuilding himself. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Blake found himself in conversation with a young man named Marcus. "You used to be like the cops that messed with me," Marcus said bluntly. "Why should I trust you now?" Blake met his gaze, unflinching. "Because I'm trying to be better." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "All right, we'll see." Weeks turned into months. Blake's shift at the precinct felt different now. He challenged his colleagues when they made assumptions, questioned his own biases before acting. One day, he got a call from Carter. "Come by my office," Carter said. "There's something you should see." When Blake arrived, Carter handed him a file. Inside was a letter of recommendation his. "You've done the work," Carter said. "Now it's time to take it further." Blake's eyes widened as he read the offer. A transfer to the Community Relations Division, where he could directly work on rebuilding trust between the police and the people they served. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly making a difference. Thanks for watching this video. Now tell me in the comments how good you thought this story was on a scale from 1 to 10. Share this video with someone who might benefit from it, and don't forget to subscribe because the stories will only get better and better.